Marcus Thompson pulled into the dimly lit gas station on that cold December evening, never knowing that the pregnant woman crying beside the broken-down luxury car would change his life forever. He saw only her tears, her swollen belly, and her obvious distress. She saw only his kind eyes and outstretched hand. Neither knew that she was Victoria Sterling, the 28-year-old CEO of Sterling Enterprises worth $300 million, or that he was about to lose his job and face eviction with his 8-year-old daughter Emma the very next week. All they knew in that moment was that sometimes strangers become angels, and sometimes a single act of kindness can transform two broken hearts into an unbreakable bond that would redefine everything they thought they knew about family, love, and the true meaning of wealth. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Marcus Thompson's worn work boots crunched against the frost-covered asphalt as he pulled into the flickering fluorescent glow of the 24-hour gas station. The December wind cut through his thin jacket like a blade, carrying with it the weight of another 12-hour shift at the warehouse and the gnawing worry that had become his constant companion. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel of his 15-year-old Honda, the heater barely functioning, the radio silent to save what little battery life remained. He had exactly $23 in his wallet, enough for gas to get through the week if he was careful, if Emma didn't need anything unexpected, if the universe could just give him a break for once. As he stepped out of his car, the cold air hit him like a physical force. But it wasn't the temperature that made him pause. Across the lot, bathed in the harsh white light of the station's overhead lamps, sat a sleek black Mercedes with its hood raised, steam rising from the engine like smoke from a dying fire. Beside it stood a young woman, maybe in her late 20s, her hands pressed against her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She was clearly pregnant, her condition obvious even beneath the oversized coat that seemed to swallow her small frame. Marcus felt his chest tighten, not from the cold, but from recognition of despair. The same despair he'd felt countless nights lying awake, wondering how he'd make rent, how he'd keep Emma fed, how he'd hold their small world together with nothing but determination and love. He looked at his gas pump, then back at the crying woman. And without hesitation, his feet carried him toward her. His own struggles momentarily forgotten in the face of someone else's immediate need. Victoria Sterling pressed her back against the cold metal of her broken Mercedes, her breath coming in short puffs that disappeared into the December night like her carefully constructed plans. The designer coat she wore was borrowed from her housekeeper, deliberately chosen to hide the Armani beneath, just as the simple wedding ring on her finger was meant to suggest a life she'd never lived. She had been driving for hours, fleeing from the suffocating glass towers of Sterling Enterprises, where her own board of directors had spent the afternoon questioning her competency, suggesting that pregnancy hormones were clouding her judgment, threatening to invoke clauses that could strip away everything she'd built since inheriting the company at 25. The irony wasn't lost on her that the $300 million empire couldn't buy her a reliable car or a moment's peace. Her phone buzzed incessantly in her purse, dozens of calls from her father, her assistant, her lawyers, all demanding she return immediately to sign papers that would essentially hand control to her uncle until after the baby was born. She couldn't breathe in that world anymore, couldn't bear another meeting where men in expensive suits made decisions about her life while she sat silent and compliant. When the footsteps approached, she didn't look up, expecting another stranger to walk past her misery as so many had before. But the voice that reached her was different, gentle, and genuinely concerned. "Miss, are you okay? Car trouble?" She glanced up to see a man in his 30s, tired eyes filled with kindness, work clothes that had seen better days, hands that spoke of honest labor. He didn't recognize her, didn't see the face that graced business magazines and society pages. To him, she was simply a pregnant woman in distress, and the relief of that anonymity nearly brought fresh tears to her eyes. Marcus pulled his cracked phone from his pocket, the screen protector held together with clear tape, and dialed the only 24-hour tow service he knew, speaking in the calm, measured tones of someone accustomed to handling crises with limited resources. "Yeah, it's Marcus Thompson. I've got a stranded motorist at the Shell on 5th Street, black Mercedes with engine trouble," he said. deliberately not mentioning that the car probably cost more than he'd make in 3 years. The woman watched him with wide, uncertain eyes, and when he hung up and told her the truck would be at least an hour, she looked so lost that something in his chest ached. "Look, I know you don't know me from Adam, but it's freezing out here and you shouldn't be standing around in your condition," Marcus said, gesturing toward his Honda with an apologetic smile. "My car's not much to look at, but the heater works most of the time. And there's a decent diner about 10 minutes away where you could warm up and maybe get something to eat." Victoria hesitated. Every instinct screamed about stranger danger, but desperation and the genuine concern in his voice made the decision for her. As they drove through the quiet streets, she found herself staring at the small photo taped to his dashboard. A school picture of a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin, the kind of genuine smile that only children possess. "Your daughter?" she asked softly. And Marcus's entire demeanor changed, his face lighting up, despite the exhaustion etched in every line. "Emma. She's 8. Smart as a whip and twice as stubborn," he said with obvious pride. Then his expression grew more somber. "Lost her mom 3 years ago? Cancer? So it's just been us two against the world ever since." Victoria felt her heart clench, recognizing the weight of single parenthood, even though her circumstances were vastly different. Understanding the fierce protectiveness in his voice, the way he spoke of his daughter like she was his entire universe compressed into one small, precious person. The diner's neon sign flickered intermittently, casting alternating shadows across Victoria's face as Marcus held the door open for her, the warm air inside carrying the comforting sense of coffee and fresh bread that made her realize she hadn't eaten since morning. She slid into the cracked vinyl booth, watching as Marcus studied the menu with the careful attention of someone who knew the price of every item, his finger tracing down the laminated pages while he calculated silently in his head. "Order whatever you want," he said, though she caught the way his eyes lingered on the prices, the subtle tension in his shoulders that spoke of financial stress. Victoria found herself ordering the simplest thing she could find, a bowl of soup and a grilled cheese sandwich, though her body craved the kind of elaborate meal she was accustomed to. When Marcus insisted she get the chicken dinner instead, claiming she needed to eat for 2, she watched in amazement as he counted out crumpled bills and loose change to cover both their meals, leaving what she suspected was his last $20 bill on the table without hesitation. She had grown up in a world where generosity was calculated, where every act of kindness came with strings attached, where people gave lavishly only when they expected something greater in return. But here was this man, this stranger who drove a car held together with hope and determination, who worked warehouse shifts and worried about rent money, and he was giving her his last dollars simply because she was pregnant and alone and needed help. As they ate, she listened to him talk about Emma's upcoming school play, about how he was learning to braid hair from YouTube videos, about the small triumphs and challenges of raising a daughter on his own, and she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the diner's heating system and everything to do with witnessing genuine human goodness in its purest form. When Victoria hesitantly admitted she had nowhere to stay for the night, her voice barely above a whisper as she stared into her empty soup bowl, Marcus didn't hesitate for even a moment before offering his couch, though she could see the internal debate flickering across his features as he weighed the risks of inviting a stranger into the home he shared with his daughter. "I know how this sounds, and I know you have every reason not to trust me, but I've got a pull-out couch and clean sheets, and no pregnant woman should be sleeping in her car or wandering around looking for a hotel at this hour," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was offering. Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes again, overwhelmed by the casual way he extended such profound kindness, treating her safety and comfort as if they mattered to him personally. The small apartment they entered was clean but sparse, filled with the kind of second-hand furniture that had been chosen for function over form, yet every surface held evidence of the love that lived within these walls. Emma's artwork covering the refrigerator, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, library books stacked neatly beside a worn armchair. Emma appeared in dinosaur pajamas, sleepy-eyed and curious, and instead of the shyness Victoria expected, the little girl approached with the fearless openness of childhood. "Daddy, is this the lady whose car broke down?" Emma asked, and when Marcus nodded, she turned to Victoria with serious 8-year-old concern. "Are you okay? Do you need some of my mom's tea?" "Daddy keeps it for when people are sad." Victoria's breath caught at the simple generosity, the way this child offered her most precious comfort to a stranger, and when Emma curled up beside her on the couch to show her a picture book about baby animals, Victoria realized she hadn't felt this kind of uncomplicated human connection in years, maybe ever. The morning sun filtered through thin curtains as Victoria stirred on the surprisingly comfortable pull-out couch, the smell of coffee and pancakes drawing her toward consciousness, but it was the sharp ring of Marcus's phone that fully woke her. She watched through half-closed eyes as he answered with the weary resignation of someone expecting bad news. His voice low and careful as Emma bustled around the kitchen, chattering about her upcoming spelling test and completely oblivious to the conversation unfolding in the living room. "I understand, Mr. Peterson. Budget cuts, I get it," Marcus said, his free hand running through his hair in a gesture that spoke of barely contained stress. No, I appreciate the 2 weeks' notice. That's more than most places give." Victoria saw the exact moment the reality hit him, watched as his shoulders sagged and his face went pale, though his voice remained steady and professional as he thanked his now former supervisor, and ended the call. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at the phone in his hand as if it might ring again with different news. Better news. Any news that wouldn't mean choosing between rent and groceries for the next month. When Emma bounded into the room asking if he wanted chocolate chips in his pancakes, Victoria witnessed something that broke her heart and amazed her simultaneously. Marcus transformed his devastation into a smile, swept his daughter into a hug, and told her that chocolate chips sounded perfect. His voice betraying nothing of the earthquake that had just shattered his carefully balanced world. After Emma skipped back to the kitchen, Victoria saw him sink onto the edge of the couch, his head in his hands for just a moment, allowing himself exactly 30 seconds of despair before straightening his spine and walking back toward his daughter's laughter. Carrying his burden alone, as he always did, Victoria's heart ached as she watched Marcus flip pancakes with forced cheerfulness. His practiced smile never wavering, even as she could see the weight of his new reality settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. After Emma left for school with a lunch packed in a reused paper bag and a kiss that seemed to energize Marcus more than any amount of coffee could, Victoria carefully approached the subject, claiming she had connections in logistics and warehousing from her previous job, offering to make some calls on his behalf. Marcus looked at her with those kind, tired eyes and shook his head gently, his pride intact despite everything. "I appreciate that, I really do, but I've been working since I was 16 and I'll figure something out," he said, already pulling out a laptop that had seen better days to start searching job boards. "Besides, you've got your own situation to worry about, and I'm not about to add my problems to yours." As he stepped outside to take the trash to the curb, Victoria noticed the stack of mail on the kitchen counter, and her blood ran cold when she saw the bright red lettering on the top envelope. Final notice. Eviction proceedings. The dates told a story of mounting desperation, late fees compounding into an impossible sum, a good man drowning in circumstances beyond his control while maintaining his dignity and his daughter's innocence. When Marcus returned, she was sitting exactly where he'd left her, but everything had changed because now she understood that his kindness to her last night hadn't come from abundance but from a heart so generous it gave, even when there was nothing left to give. The weight of that realization, the knowledge that this man had literally given her his last $20 while facing homelessness, made her feel both humbled and desperate to help in ways that wouldn't wound his pride or reveal the vast chasm between their circumstances. Over the next 3 days, Victoria moved through Marcus's world like a guardian angel in disguise, using her phone to orchestrate a series of small miracles while he believed she was simply resting and recovering from her ordeal. She memorized the account numbers from the eviction notice, the utility companies listed on his bills, and with a few carefully placed calls to her personal assistant, under the guise of helping a friend in need, she set wheels in motion that would appear entirely coincidental. When Marcus's phone rang with job opportunities from companies he'd applied to months ago, when the electric company called to inform him of a billing error that resulted in a significant credit to his account, when his landlord mysteriously received an anonymous money order covering 3 months of back rent. Marcus accepted each stroke of luck with the bewildered gratitude of someone unaccustomed to good fortune. "I don't understand it," he told Victoria as they sat in his small kitchen. Emma at school and the afternoon light streaming through clean windows that Victoria had quietly arranged to have washed by a service claiming they were running a promotion in the neighborhood. "It's like everything's turning around all at once, you know. Maybe Sarah's watching out for us from wherever she is." Victoria's throat tightened at the mention of his late wife, at the way he attributed his sudden good fortune to divine intervention rather than suspecting human manipulation, and she found herself both proud of her ability to help and guilty about the deception required to do so. Each anonymous gift she arranged felt like a small act of rebellion against the cold, calculating world she came from, where generosity was always public and always came with expectations, where kindness was a commodity to be traded rather than a grace to be freely given. The fever struck Emma on Thursday night like a thunderbolt, her small body burning with a temperature that sent Marcus into the controlled panic of a parent who had already lost too much. Victoria watched him pace the emergency room waiting area, his hands shaking as he filled out forms he couldn't afford, his voice steady but strained as he explained Emma's symptoms to the triage nurse, while mentally calculating the cost of each minute they spent under those harsh fluorescent lights. When the doctor emerged with a prescription for antibiotics that would cost $230, medication that Emma needed to prevent her minor infection from becoming something far more dangerous, Victoria saw Marcus's face crumble for just an instant before he straightened his shoulders and told the doctor they'd fill it right away. At the pharmacy counter, she watched him check his bank balance on his phone 3 times. Watched him quietly ask the pharmacist about payment plans or generic alternatives. Watched him realize that even with his recent mysterious windfall, the money was already allocated to rent and utilities and there simply wasn't enough. Victoria excused herself to the restroom, her heart pounding as she made a quick call to her driver, instructing him to immediately drop an envelope of cash at the pharmacy's customer service desk, with a note claiming it had been found in the parking lot with Marcus's name on it. When she returned, Marcus was staring at the envelope in his hands like it contained a miracle, and perhaps it did. "I can't keep accepting this kind of luck," he whispered to her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "A pregnant woman I barely know. And here I am taking help when you probably need every penny yourself." Victoria placed her hand over his, feeling the calluses and wondering how she would ever find the courage to tell him the truth about who she really was. The knock on Marcus's apartment door came at 7 in the morning, sharp and authoritative, followed by a woman's voice that could cut glass. "Miss Sterling, I know you're in there, and we need to discuss your immediate return to the office." Victoria's face went white as snow, and Marcus watched in confusion as she pressed herself against the kitchen wall, frantically shaking her head and mouthing the word no with desperate intensity. Through the peephole, Marcus saw a woman in an expensive suit, perfectly coiffed hair, holding what appeared to be legal documents and wearing the expression of someone accustomed to getting her way. "Miss Sterling, the board meeting is in 2 hours, and your uncle has already begun proceedings to invoke the competency clause," the woman continued, her voice carrying clearly through the thin door. "Your father is beside himself, and frankly, this disappearing act is only strengthening their case that you're not mentally stable enough to run a $300 million company." Marcus felt the pieces clicking together with sickening clarity as he looked back at Victoria, who was now sitting heavily on his couch, her head in her hands, the carefully constructed story of her circumstances crumbling around them both. The expensive car that had broken down so conveniently, the way she never seemed to worry about money despite claiming to have nothing, the mysterious phone calls she took in whispered conversations, the educated way she spoke even when trying to sound common. Sterling Enterprises, he realized with a jolt. The same Sterling whose logo he'd seen on billboards and business magazines, whose CEO was rumored to be young and brilliant and worth more money than most people could imagine. As the assistant finally retreated, promising to return with security if necessary, Marcus stared at the woman he'd taken into his home, wondering who she really was and what she could possibly want with a man like him. Marcus waited until Emma left for school before turning to face Victoria, his expression gentle but resolute, like a man who had learned to handle difficult conversations with the careful grace of someone who understood that truth, however painful, was always better than beautiful lies. Victoria Sterling, he said quietly, not as an accusation but as a simple statement of fact, and watched as her shoulders sagged with the weight of a secret finally exposed to daylight. I'm not angry. I'm just trying to understand why the CEO of one of the biggest companies in the state was crying at a gas station, pretending to be broke and sleeping on my couch. Victoria looked up at him with eyes that held 3 days' worth of unshed tears, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because for the first time in my life, someone looked at me and didn't see dollar signs or stock options or marriage proposals, she said, her hands trembling as she pressed them against her swollen belly. My own father hasn't spoken to me since I got pregnant. Not because he disapproves, but because he's too busy calculating how this affects the company's public image. My board thinks I'm incompetent because I'm carrying a child, and the man who got me pregnant disappeared the moment he realized I wouldn't sign over half my assets in a prenuptial agreement. Her voice broke completely then, the years of loneliness and isolation pouring out in gasping sobs. I've been surrounded by people my entire life who only wanted what I could give them. And then I met you and Emma, and you gave me soup and a warm couch and asked for nothing in return, and I was so afraid that if you knew who I really was, you'd either want something from me or think I was just playing games with your life. Marcus sat down beside her, his own world reeling but his heart steady, and said the words that would change everything between them. Victoria, I still see you, not your bank account. Victoria's hands moved protectively over her belly as she found the courage to tell Marcus the whole truth, her voice steadier now that the dam of secrecy had finally burst. His name was Richard Caldwell, and I thought he loved me, she began, staring at a framed photo of Marcus and Emma on the side table, finding strength in their genuine smiles. He was charming, sophisticated, everything my father thought I should want in a husband, and for 6 months I believed I'd finally found someone who saw past the money and the company to the person underneath. Her laugh was bitter, hollow, the sound of innocence lost and wisdom gained too late. But when I got pregnant and suggested we get married, he showed up to dinner with a prenuptial agreement that would have given him controlling interest in Sterling Enterprises if anything happened to me, plus $50 million just for saying I do. Marcus felt his jaw clench at the calculated cruelty of it, but he remained silent, sensing she needed to purge this poison from her system. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was realizing that my own father knew, had probably orchestrated the whole thing as some kind of corporate merger disguised as romance. Victoria continued, tears flowing freely now. I've spent my entire life wondering if anyone could love me for myself, and when I finally thought I'd found that person, he turned out to be just another predator in an expensive suit. She looked directly at Marcus then, her eyes raw but determined. So I ran, took nothing but some clothes and my car, because I realized my baby deserves to come into a world where love actually exists, where kindness isn't transactional, where a man like you can spend his last $20 on soup for a stranger simply because it's the right thing to do. Marcus sat in stunned silence for a long moment, his mind processing the magnitude of deception alongside the heartbreaking vulnerability that had driven it, and when he finally spoke, his voice held no trace of anger or betrayal, only a deep, aching understanding. You weren't testing me, he said quietly, his eyes never leaving her face. You were protecting yourself. And honestly, after what you've been through, I can't say I blame you. Victoria looked at him with wonder, as if she'd braced for judgment and received grace instead, as if she'd expected him to demand explanations for the anonymous money and mysterious good fortune, and found him concerned only with her pain. I keep thinking about that night at the gas station, how lost you looked, and now I understand it wasn't just car trouble, it was everything trouble, Marcus continued, unconsciously echoing the way his daughter sometimes described overwhelming situations. The money, the job opportunities, Emma's medicine, all of that was you, wasn't it? When she nodded, shame coloring her cheeks, he surprised her by reaching over and taking her hand. Victoria, I should be angry about the deception, but all I can think about is how you've been carrying this baby and all this heartbreak, and still found it in yourself to worry about me and Emma. His thumb traced gently over her knuckles, a gesture so natural and comforting that it made her breath catch. You want to know what genuine human connection looks like? It's not about money or status or even honesty at first meeting. It's about seeing someone's heart and choosing to care for it regardless of the package it comes wrapped in. For the first time since she'd discovered Richard's betrayal, Victoria felt the possibility that she might actually be worthy of love, not because of what she owned or could provide, but simply because of who she was in the quiet moments when all the walls came down. The convoy of black sedans arrived like storm clouds at noon, disgorging an army of suits that transformed Marcus's quiet apartment complex into a corporate battlefield, and Victoria knew her carefully constructed sanctuary was about to be destroyed by the very people who claimed to love her. Her father emerged from the lead car looking every inch the powerful businessman who had built an empire from nothing, his steel-gray hair perfectly styled, despite the obvious stress lines etched deeper around his eyes, followed by her uncle Robert, whose calculating smile made Victoria's skin crawl, and finally the family attorney whose briefcase undoubtedly contained documents that would strip away everything she'd worked for. Victoria Sterling, this childish game ends now, her father announced as he strode through Marcus's door without invitation, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to boardrooms and hostile takeovers. You've left the company vulnerable to market fluctuations, missed 3 critical board meetings, and your behavior has become increasingly erratic since this pregnancy began. Robert stepped forward with practiced concern, his voice dripping false sympathy. Sweetheart, we understand that hormonal changes can affect judgment and decision-making capacity, which is why we've consulted with several psychiatrists who agree that temporary guardianship would be in everyone's best interest until after the baby arrives. Victoria felt the familiar suffocation of their control closing around her, but this time she wasn't alone. This time Marcus stood beside her with Emma clutching his hand, their small family unit, a stark contrast to the cold corporate machinery arrayed against them. Dr. Harrison has prepared a comprehensive evaluation documenting your flight from responsibility, your association with unsuitable companions, Robert continued, gesturing dismissively toward Marcus, and your refusal to consider what's best for Sterling Enterprises. The attorney opened his briefcase with theatrical precision, revealing legal documents that would declare her mentally incompetent, strip her of corporate control, and place her under the guardianship of men who saw her pregnancy not as the creation of new life, but as a liability to be managed until it was no longer inconvenient to their plans. Marcus stepped forward then, his work-calloused hands steady despite facing men who could buy and sell his entire life without blinking, his voice quiet but carrying the unshakable conviction of a man who had faced far worse things than corporate bullies and emerged with his soul intact. With all due respect, gentlemen, this is my home, and you're speaking about Victoria like she's not standing right here, like she's some kind of property instead of a grown woman capable of making her own decisions. Robert's eyebrows shot up in amused disbelief that a warehouse worker would dare challenge their authority, but Marcus continued without flinching, his protective instincts fully awakened. I've watched this woman for the past week, seen how she interacts with my daughter, how she thinks through problems, how she handles stress, and there's nothing mentally unstable about someone who chooses to step away from toxicity to protect her unborn child. Victoria's father began to speak, but Marcus held up his hand with surprising authority. You want to talk about what's best for Sterling Enterprises? Maybe start by asking why your CEO felt she had to disappear to find basic human decency. His voice grew stronger with each word, months of his own powerlessness transforming into fierce advocacy for someone else. She's not your business asset. She's not your breeding stock for corporate mergers. And she sure as hell isn't mentally incompetent just because she refuses to let you control her life choices. Victoria felt something crack open in her chest, a sensation she'd never experienced before. Watching this man with no money, no influence, no power in their world stand between her and the forces that had controlled her entire existence. No one had ever fought for her before. Not her father. Not Richard. Certainly not the parade of men who had seen her as a stepping stone to wealth. But here was Marcus Thompson, risking the wrath of people who could destroy him, simply because it was right, simply because she mattered to him as a person rather than as an asset to be managed. The first contraction hit Victoria like lightning in the middle of her father's angry response to Marcus. her sharp intake of breath cutting through the heated arguments as she doubled over, one hand gripping the back of Marcus's couch and the other instinctively moving to her belly, where she felt the unmistakable warmth spreading down her legs. "Oh no, not now, please not now," she whispered, but her baby had apparently decided that this moment of family chaos was the perfect time to make an entrance into the world, and another contraction followed so quickly that she cried out in pain and surprise. Marcus was beside her instantly, his arm supporting her weight while her father and uncle stood frozen in corporate confusion, utterly unprepared for the messy reality of childbirth interrupting their carefully orchestrated power play. "Emma, grab the bag by the door. We're going to the hospital right now," Marcus called to his daughter while helping Victoria toward the door, his voice calm and decisive despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Her father finally found his voice, demanding that they wait for the family physician, insisting that sterling heirs were born in private suites with the best doctors money could buy. But Victoria was already in Marcus's Honda, breathing through contractions that were coming faster than seemed possible for a first baby. During the frantic drive to the nearest hospital, with Emma chattering nervously in the back seat about how this was just like when her hamster had babies, Victoria reached for Marcus's hand between contractions and made a decision that would reshape everything. "I want you with me," she gasped as another wave of pain crashed over her. "Not them, not the lawyers or doctors they choose, just you. Because you're the only family that matters to me now." When they rushed through the emergency doors, Victoria's father and uncle arriving minutes later in their expensive cars, the nurses asked who should be contacted as next of kin, and Victoria looked directly at Marcus Thompson, the man who had given her soup and kindness, and was now holding her hand through the most important moment of her life, and said without hesitation, "He is." 7 hours later, as the first light of dawn painted the hospital room in soft pastels, Victoria Sterling held her daughter for the first time while Marcus sat beside her bed, and Emma peered over the safety rail with the reverent wonder of a child meeting a miracle. The baby was perfect, 6 pounds and 2 ounces of wrinkled pink possibility, with wisps of dark hair and tiny fingers that wrapped instinctively around Victoria's thumb, as if she already understood that love was something to be held tightly. "She's so little," Emma whispered, her voice filled with the hushed awe that hospitals seem to inspire in children. "And look, she's got your nose, Victoria." Marcus had stayed through every contraction, every moment of panic when the monitors beeped ominously, every exhausted breath Victoria took, as she brought new life into a world that suddenly seemed full of hope, instead of corporate machinations and prenuptial betrayals. Her father and uncle had eventually retreated to the waiting room, uncomfortable with the raw intimacy of birth, leaving Marcus to hold her hand and whisper encouragements that meant more than any business contract ever could. Now, watching him gently stroke the baby's tiny hand while Emma made soft cooing sounds, Victoria felt something settle in her chest that she'd been searching for her entire life without knowing its name. "I want to step back from Sterling Enterprises," she said quietly, the words surprising even herself with their certainty. "Not forever, but for now, for her, so she grows up knowing that love doesn't come with conditions or board meetings or hostile takeover attempts." Marcus looked at her with understanding rather than shock, as if he'd somehow known this decision was coming. "You're sure?" he asked. Not about the money or the power she'd be giving up, but about whether this choice came from her heart rather than fear. Victoria looked down at her daughter, then at Emma, who was already planning all the things she would teach her new baby sister. Then at Marcus, whose presence had shown her what family could actually feel like. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." 3 weeks after bringing baby Grace home to Marcus's small apartment, Victoria sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by business plans and legal documents, her voice steady with newfound purpose as she outlined the proposal that had been forming in her mind since the day he'd defended her against her own family. "I don't want to give you money, Marcus. I want to invest in you," she said, sliding a folder across the scratched wooden surface that contained more financial projections than he'd ever seen in one place. "You have 20 years of warehouse and logistics experience. You understand supply chains and inventory management better than most people with business degrees, and you've been thinking about starting your own consulting firm since before we met." Marcus stared at the documents with the careful attention of someone who had learned to be suspicious of gifts that seemed too good to be true, but Victoria pressed on, her passion evident in every word. "This isn't charity. This is partnership between two people who've seen each other at our worst and chosen to stay, who've built something real together that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with trust." She leaned forward, Grace sleeping peacefully in the carrier beside her, Emma doing homework at the coffee table, with the casual acceptance of a child who had already integrated this expanded family into her worldview. "I need something meaningful to do with Sterling's resources, something that creates value instead of just accumulating wealth, and you need the capital to turn your expertise into independence." Marcus looked up from the projections, seeing not the CEO who could write checks that would change his life, but the woman who had washed dishes in his sink and read bedtime stories to his daughter and held his hand through the scariest and most beautiful night of both their lives. "Equal partners?" he asked. And when she nodded without hesitation, extending her hand across the table with the same genuine smile she'd worn when offering to help him search for jobs, he knew that some investments had nothing to do with money and everything to do with building a future together. 9 months later, Marcus stood in the gleaming offices of Thompson Logistics Solutions, watching through floor-to-ceiling windows as delivery trucks bearing his company logo navigated the morning traffic, still occasionally pinching himself to make sure this wasn't an elaborate dream that would dissolve when Emma shook him awake for breakfast. The business had grown beyond even Victoria's optimistic projections, built on Marcus's genuine understanding of working-class needs and Victoria's strategic mind that could spot market opportunities like a hawk finding prey. Their partnership had evolved into something seamless, Marcus handling operations and client relations, while Victoria managed finances and long-term planning, both of them discovering that their different backgrounds created a synergy neither could have achieved alone. At home, their blended family had found its rhythm in the spacious house Victoria had purchased not as a display of wealth, but as a sanctuary where love could grow without the constraints of thin walls and worried neighbors. Emma had embraced her role as big sister with the fierce protectiveness of someone who understood that families came in all shapes and sizes, spending hours teaching Grace to clap her hands and make babbling sounds that Emma insisted were attempts at saying Emma first. Victoria had learned to braid hair almost as well as Marcus, though she still relied on YouTube tutorials for the more complex styles Emma requested, and Marcus had discovered that changing diapers at 3 in the morning was infinitely easier when there was someone to share the burden and laugh about the chaos together. The Sterling Enterprises board had eventually accepted Victoria's reduced role, her uncle taking over day-to-day operations, while she maintained controlling interest and focused on philanthropic initiatives that gave her wealth purpose beyond mere accumulation. Most evenings found them gathered around the dinner table, Emma chattering about school while Grace gurgled happily in her high chair, and Victoria would catch Marcus's eye across the chaos and see reflected there the same wonder she felt every day at how completely their broken pieces had fitted together into something whole. The wedding took place in Victoria's garden on a crisp October morning, 18 months after that fateful night at the gas station, with Emma serving as both flower girl and maid of honor, while baby Grace sat in the front row, wearing a tiny dress that matched Victoria's simple ivory gown. Victoria had insisted on writing her own vows, her voice clear and unwavering as she spoke. Not of love at first sight, but of love that grew from kindness, from seeing someone's true heart beneath life's accumulated bruises and choosing to tend it like a precious garden. "You taught me that wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or stock portfolios, but in moments like Emma teaching Grace to walk, in late-night conversations when the baby finally sleeps, in the way you still hold doors open for strangers and give your last dollar to someone who needs it more." Marcus's vows were shorter but no less profound, his calloused hands gentle as they held hers, his voice thick with emotion as he promised to love not just Victoria, but the family they'd built together from broken pieces and stubborn hope. The reception was small and perfect, filled with the warehouse workers who had become Marcus's first clients, the teachers from Emma's school who had watched their family transform, and even Victoria's father, who had slowly come to understand that his daughter's happiness mattered more than corporate succession plans. As they danced to a song Emma had chosen because it reminded her of the first night Victoria had stayed on their couch, Victoria looked around at the faces of people who loved them for who they were rather than what they could provide, and realized that true wealth had always been within her reach, waiting patiently for her to understand that love shared was the only investment that guaranteed returns. Years later, when Emma would tell the story of how her family came together, she would always begin the same way her father had taught her to tell any good story. Once upon a time, there was a man who stopped to help a stranger, never knowing that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as ordinary kindness, and that the richest families are built not from money but from hearts brave enough to choose love over fear, again and again, until choosing love becomes as natural as breathing.